We tend to romanticize the act of writing. We imagine an author sitting calmly at a desk, perhaps looking out a window for inspiration, deliberately arranging words like silver cutlery on a Sunday dinner table. It appears as a choice, a peaceful intellectual exercise. But if you look inside the pages of Vortex d'encre, that romantic image doesn't just fade, it is violently torn apart. In this narrative, writing isn't a career move or a hobby. It is a physiological reflex, described with the raw urgency of a body gasping for air. The Medding isn't a study, but a studio boat, a tiny room transformed into a survival vessel because the outside world has become too toxic to enter. Following a shattering event in May 2025, the narrator describes a reality where inanimate objects, a coffee maker, a faucet, the walls themselves, become more real and safe than human beings. It creates a jarring, fascinating contradiction. A book that explicitly claims it was never meant to be literature, but rather an extra organ, grown out of necessity to keep a heart beating when the nervous system has exploded in silence. It forces us to ask, what kind of impact is severe enough to turn a ballpoint pen into the only thing standing between a woman and total collapse?
That phrase alone, an extra organ, is just so powerful. It immediately tells you to throw out everything you think you know about writing as, a creative choice.
Right. This isn't about art. It's about survival.
Absolutely. And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're going to take that visceral, powerful description and connect it to the hard science. We're going to analyze how severe personal trauma actually forces the brain and the body into this emergency survival mode.
And then the really crucial part, how does the act of writing, of structuring a narrative, become this essential tool for biological and psychological reconstruction?
It's the architecture of healing, built word by word.
So we're going to structure our conversation today around three main themes, sort of building from the inside out.
Okay.
First, we'll dig into that biological function of writing we just mentioned, how it stops being a choice and becomes a reflex, that extra organ. Then we'll look at the incredible obstacles, both internal and external, that survivors face when trying to heal.
Which are often deeply misunderstood.
Exactly. And finally, we'll look at this idea of reclaiming your identity through creative expression, specifically within a confined, safe space like that studio boat. It's really an exploration of how structure can save a collapsing self.
A great way to frame it.
So let's start with that central idea. The source material is it's shockingly direct about this. Writing is not an art form here, it's a physiological necessity. The author uses the term deuxième souffle, a second breath.
And that language is so critical because it forces us to think about the body, the physical body in distress. When the narrator says this act of writing was non-voluntary, that it was born from a fracture.
It's a fracture, yeah.
And the only alternative was, and this is a direct quote, apnea, definitive apnea?
Yeah.
I mean, they are literally translating a biological failure, a panic state, into metaphor.
Apnea, when the body just stops breathing.
Exactly. So the writing isn't a hobby. It's the desperate, ragged gasp for air that prevents total suffocation. It's life support.
And the purpose, as she states it, is to keep the heart beating when the nervous system has exploded in silence. Let's talk about that. What is actually happening inside the body during that kind of silent explosion?
Okay, so you have to picture the brain's alarm system. It's centered in a little almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. After severe trauma, that system it's put on a hair trigger. It's hypersensitized.
So any little thing can set it off.
Any little thing. A smell, a sound, even a quiet moment can act as a trigger. And that sets off what we call a physiological hijack. And I want to be clear, this isn't just feeling anxious. This is a full-blown, all-hands-on-deck, code-red survival response from the body.
The body thinks it's an immediate physical danger, right? Even if the threat is just a memory.
Precisely. You can't tell the difference. So the heart rate skyrockets, adrenaline and cortisol flood the system, breathing gets shallow and fast. And critically, blood flow is diverted away from the parts of the brain that do high-level thinking.
The prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex. The part responsible for logic, for sequencing events, for rational thought, for language. It basically goes dark. It goes offline. The body is reacting to an old threat as if it is happening right now. That explosion in silence is the perfect description for that internal chaos.
But that makes the act of writing seem almost impossible. If the language center of your brain is offline, how can you even form a sentence?
That's the paradox, isn't it? The body has to find a workaround. And this is where the writing, the vortex donk, becomes a form of what you could call neurological grounding. It's a conscious, deliberate intervention.
So you're forcing the system back online.
You're forcing it. When a survivor makes themselves describe a tiny concrete detail, the color of the wall, the smell of rain, the taste of coffee, they are performing a kind of cognitive triage. They are manually forcing the brain to re-engage its analytical language processing machinery.
It's like hitting a manual override on the panic button.
That's a perfect analogy. Instead of letting that raw, terrifying emotion just loop endlessly in the limbic system, in the amygdala, the act of putting it into words forces that memory into a structured analytical format. You're literally converting terrifying energy into grammar.
So it's regulation, it's not creation.
It is 100% regulation. You're using the pen to impose order on internal chaos, one painful sentence at a time.
The book uses another incredible phrase for this, l'effondrement en chantier, transforming the collapse into a construction site.
And that's fundamental. It's not just about stopping the collapse. It's about actively repurposing the rubble. If the trauma is a fever, a state of total dysregulation, then the process is described as letting the encore refroidir la fièvre, letting the ink cool the fever.
A physical cooling.
A physical conscious act to stop a total system meltdown. By turning the collapse into a construction site, you're creating the blueprint for biological reconstruction.
And what does that reconstruction actually feel like?
Well, the source material gives us the answer to that too. Each news story that's written is described as a muscle revenue à la vie, a muscle return to life. Think about it. If you've been bedridden, your muscles atrophy. You can't just decide to be strong again. You have to do painful, repetitive physical therapy. Writing, in this context, is mental and emotional physical therapy. The brain is rebuilding its narrative muscle.
So it's not just about telling a story. It's about retraining the brain to think in a sequence again.
Exactly, to create cause and effect out of what feels like pure, random chaos. It fundamentally changes your relationship with the past. It stops being a continuous physical threat and starts becoming a set of data points that you can organize and eventually control.
And this leads us right into this really powerful modern framework for understanding all of this, the neuroplastic narrative.
It does, because this reflexive, urgent writing style we're seeing is a perfect illustration of it. The core idea of the neuroplastic narrative is that we have to stop pathologizing survival.
What do you mean by that? Because normally when we talk about trauma, we use terms like PTSD, depression, anxiety. We frame them as disorders, as a kind of mental illness.
Right, as a brokenness, a malfunction. The neuroplastic narrative completely reframes that. It says that the emotional and psychological suffering you see after trauma is not a pathology. It is the cost of surviving. It's the price of adapting to a hostile environment.
So a healthy brain is just one that can adapt to its experience, no matter what that experience is.
Exactly. The brain is the ultimate adaptation machine. So if you grew up in a dangerous, unpredictable home, the fact that you're now hypervigilant and anxious isn't a sign that your brain is broken. It's a sign that your brain did its job perfectly. It adapted to keep you alive.
That anxiety is a feature, not a bug.
It's a finely tuned predictive engine. The brain evolved these powerful mechanisms to embed our past experiences so we can anticipate future danger. And these mechanisms are all grouped under the umbrella of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically change its own structure and function.
Okay, we need to break that down because this is where the biology gets so fascinating. You're talking about things like epigenetics, neurogenesis, white matter plasticity. How does an experience, something invisible, actually change the physical brain?
Let's start with epigenetics. So think of your DNA as this enormous library of instruction manuals. Epigenetic changes don't rewrite the text in the books, but they act like little sticky notes or highlighters. They tell your cells, hey, read this chapter constantly,
right,
or ignore this section completely.
Okay.
Chronic stress, like from abuse, can put a chemical tag on the genes that regulate your stress response. So it doesn't change the gene itself, but it changes the gene's expression.
It turns the volume dial up or down.
That's right. It might crank the volume on your stress response up to 11 permanently. So you react much more intensely to minor threats than someone who didn't have that early adversity. The past environment is literally embedded in your biology.
And what about the actual structure of the brain? Neurogenesis and white matter plasticity? That sounds like you're physically reshaping the organ.
You are. Neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons. It happens mostly in the hippocampus, which is critical for memory and emotional regulation. Now, we know that chronic toxic stress literally shrinks the hippocampus. It suppresses the creation of new brain cells.
Which is why trauma memories are often so fragmented and hard to access.
Exactly. The brain's library is being physically damaged. On the flip side, things like narrative therapy can actually stimulate neurogenesis, helping to rebuild that very architecture.
And white matter.
White matter is the brain's high-speed internet cabling. It's the wiring that connects different regions. When you constantly use a certain neural circuit, like the one connecting threat detection in the amygdala to your immediate panic response, the brain reinforces that pathway. It makes the wiring thicker and faster.
So if you're hypervigilant, it's because your brain has literally built a superhighway for panic.
It's an efficient adaptation to a hostile world. And this is why it is so stunning to realize that emotional abuse isn't just an invisible wound. It physically alters gray and white matter volume in the brain.
This moves us into something called life history theory, right? The idea of a fast life strategist.
Yes, because if the brain is shaped by anticipation, then early adversity programs it for a specific kind of life. If you grow up in a dangerous, unstable environment, your physiology basically does a calculation. It concludes you're unlikely to live a long, peaceful life.
So why invest in the long term?
Why invest in long-term health, a robust immune system, or slow, careful decision-making if you probably won't be around to see the benefits? The body starts trading long-term health for short-term survival.
And this shows up as behaviors that society often judges very harshly.
Exactly. Impulsive decisions, substance use, high-risk behaviors. These are all attempts to find swift relief from a nervous system that is biologically programmed for chaos and immediate threat. We call them character flaws or pathologies.
When really they're adaptations.
Your biologically driven adaptations develop during desperate times. The person isn't broken. Their brain just works differently because it had to. They have what we might call neuroecological diversity.
Which makes that act of writing we started with even more profound. It's not just telling a story. You're performing an emergency architectural repair on a brain that is biologically wired to expect the worst.
You're fighting biology with narrative.
And if that's the tool for repair, then we have to talk about what stops people from even picking it up. The path to what's called post-traumatic growth, or PTG, is described by survivors as just.
So confusing.
Yeah, PTG is this idea of positive psychological change after trauma, a kind of personal resurrection. But that word, confusing, is so important because the survivor's trying to process this immense internal pain while the world around them is often saying, it's over, you should be fine now.
Right. And we looked at research that detailed the major obstacles faced by female survivors of intimate partner violence. And the thing that just leaps off the page is that most of the obstacles were interpersonal. It was the internal battle that was the hardest. That is the crucial insight. The external threats were real, the perpetrator, the legal system. But the internal landscape was the most formidable enemy. They had to win the war inside first. Let's start with what the women in the study said was the hardest part of all: shame and self-blame.
Why is shame so uniquely paralyzing?
Shame is the deep, primal fear of being cast out. It tells you that you are fundamentally flawed, that you're unworthy of belonging. And for survivors, this manifests as this relentless thought, I should have known better. They see the abuse as a personal failure.
So they hide it.
They hide it because the shame of admitting what happened feels enormous, to use one survivor's word. You fear losing your credibility, being stigmatized, or worse, confirming your own internalized belief that you are worthless. Shame prevents you from seeking the very help you need.
It's a vicious cycle. The trauma creates isolation, and the shame locks the door.
Perfectly put. And that's coupled with this feeling of a broken self-identity. The abuse shatters who you thought you were. Survivors describe feeling aimless, lost. This leads to intense self-criticism, body image issues. One woman felt her body was appalling long after she was safe. And this constant state of anxiety, like being in a free fall.
You don't trust your own judgment anymore.
You don't trust anything about yourself. And when that loss of purpose combines with the self-blame, the result can be, it can be lethal.
It leads to the next obstacle, suicidal thoughts.
It does. When you feel like the scum of the earth and you truly believe that you are the source of all the problems, you can start to think that your absence would make everything better for everyone else. It's a devastatingly logical conclusion born from an illogical situation.
And all of this internal warfare is happening while the external world is often making things worse. Let's talk about the interpersonal and external obstacles.
Because they often act as constant reminders that safety is an illusion. The most obvious one is the perpetrator. Just because you leave doesn't mean you're free. The study detailed constant harassment, stalking, legal games, an increase in psychological violence after separation.
The abuser's trying to maintain a psychological presence.
To make sure the survivor's nervous system never gets the all-clear signal, they're described as hovering around them like a fly, a constant buzzing reminder of their lack of control.
And children are so often used as the primary tool for that.
The children were a source of profound sorrow and anger, not just because of the trauma they witnessed, but because the mother is often legally forced to send them back into contact with the abusive father.
Custody battles become another weapon.
A huge one. It forces the mother back into proximity with her abuser and delays her own recovery indefinitely. And this leads to the final, infuriating obstacle: the institutional systems.
The very systems that are supposed to help.
Often they re-traumatize. Laws that force communication about assets or children. The impossibly slow and complicated process of getting financial support. And the constant fear, often wielded as a threat by the abuser, that child protection services will take the children away. All of it keeps women silent and stuck.
Which underscores why that internal solution, the writing, the studio bateau, had to be so powerful. The outside world wasn't going to provide the safety or the structure she needed.
Exactly. The lack of external safety makes that setting, the studio bateau, not just a metaphor, but an absolute necessity. It's the counter-architecture to the world's chaos.
It's a vessel of survival. Why a boat, do you think?
A boat is designed to navigate a dangerous, unpredictable element, the water. It carries you and your essential cargo through a lethal environment to a safe shore. The studio isn't a passive refuge. It's a working laboratoire d'alchimie, a laboratory of alchemy.
Where chaos is transformed into something structured, into material. This means the isolation isn't a symptom of the trauma. It's a deliberate therapeutic strategy. When the world is toxic, a small, controlled space becomes a coffer-fort, sensorial, a sensory safe.
It's the only way for the nervous system to finally stand down.
It's the non-negotiable prerequisite. The body has to feel physically secure before the mind can do any deep, creative work.
And inside that safe space, something really interesting happens. The inanimate objects become characters. The jar becomes the breath refusing to die. Solitude is the only stable presence.
This is so telling. It highlights the massive relational trust deficit that trauma creates. Humans have proven to be unpredictable, dangerous. But a coffee maker, a wall, they're stable, they do their job. The faucet is described as nervous like a male who no longer knows how to behave. She's projecting her anxiety onto it, but it's a manageable anxiety.
It provides routine, and we saw that a loss of routine was a huge obstacle for survivors.
Yes. When your internal world is chaos, you need external discipline. A dedicated writing space provides that anchor. Just entering the room becomes a psychological trigger that signals safety and purpose.
But let me ask you this, because it's an important question. Does this necessary isolation ever risk becoming a trap? If you build a fortress against a toxic world, do you ever leave it?
That's a very valid concern. But the key here is the purpose of the isolation. The studio bateau is a work site, a laboratory. It's not a retirement home. The author isn't isolating to avoid her feelings. She's isolating to actively process them through the disciplined work of writing.
So the narrative she creates inside the fortress is her bridge back to the world.
It is her bridge. The physical boundary might be temporary, but the psychological structure she builds inside it is permanent. It's the difference between hiding from a storm and building a seaworthy ship in a dry dock so you can eventually sail again.
That makes sense. And the smallness of the space also reinforces boundaries, which were so violated during the trauma.
It communicates respect for her work, her time, herself, and affirmation she desperately needs.
So with the writer biologically regulated and physically safe, the real work of identity reconstruction can begin. This is what's sometimes called scriptotherapy.
Yes, and it's here that the survivor can finally transition from being the object of the trauma to the master of its meaning.
The material we're looking at really emphasizes fiction for this work. Why would writing a fictional story be more effective than, say, a straightforward memoir at this early stage?
2 words: protective distance. When shame is so high, writing a memoir feels terrifyingly exposed. It's too raw. Fiction allows the author to explore the most painful topics by placing them onto a character who is not her present self.
They can write someone else's story until we have the space to own it as our own.
That's the core of it. Fiction provides this crucial layer of emotional insulation. The writer is in total control. They decide what to include, what to omit, what to change. By labeling it fiction, they relieve the pressure of perfect accuracy and the immediate fear of judgment.
And this act of taking control is the reclamation of agency.
It is the entire mechanism. The person who felt small and powerless becomes the all-powerful author. They control the pacing, the climax, the characters' responses, and, most importantly, they can change the ending. In the world of the text, they are finally in charge.
And this helps integrate those fragmented trauma memories we talked about earlier.
It forces them into a sequence. It imposes chronology and meaning. Fragmented images and sensations are like shrapnel in the brain. The act of forcing them into a coherent narrative, this happened and so I did this, allows the brain to replace the self-blame narrative with one of context and empathy.
You know, this isn't a new idea. When you look at literary figures like Virginia Woolf, her work is almost a blueprint for this kind of therapeutic writing.
Woolf is a perfect case study. As a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, her unique, fragmented writing style wasn't just an artistic choice. It was a psychological necessity. She used that stream of consciousness approach to represent her own fractured psyche.
So the structure of a novel like Mrs. Dalloway actually mirrors the structure of a traumatized mind.
Absolutely. The fragmentation is the point. Her goal wasn't just to record her trauma, but to exorcise it, to give it voice and structure. Her own diaries talk about writing helping her put together the shocks of her youth, which helped take away the pain. The creative act was self-medication through mastery.
And in Mrs. Dalloway, the two central characters, Clarissa and the soldier Septimus, they represent different facets of this.
It's a masterstroke. Septimus represents the kind of trauma society was beginning to recognize. Male shell shock, PTSD, he collapses. But Clarissa represents the female survivor, grappling with her own internal ruptures, and she finds a way to stand.
Her obsession with hosting her party is her way of creating order.
It's the ultimate act of agency reclamation. She controls the environment, the guest list, the narrative of the evening. Through that act, she integrates the fragments of her past and achieves a kind of self-unification. Woolf used Clarissa to show that a survivor, even one silenced by society, can construct a narrative that allows her to stand whole.
So we've come from this raw physiological reflex all the way to this act of literary mastery. And what emerges in the end is what the author of Vortex Knonkra calls a radical aesthetic of survival.
And that aesthetic is a testament to the fact that pain can be transformed into architecture. It's not pretty or gentle. The author writes, like one who dances on the embers. Humor is a shield, solitude an accomplice. The final book is blunt, poetic, and incisive all at once.
The goal isn't a perfect novel. The goal is proof. Proof that you can lose everything and still stand up, even if you're trembling. It proves that a body in collapse can write better than one standing upright.
And that shifts the entire internal narrative. The person is no longer defined solely by their victimhood. They see that they are also a survivor, a builder, a fighter in their own story.
The reconstruction was clandestine, hidden away, but it was powerful.
So powerful. And the focus finally shifts. It's no longer about what was lost, the world that was stolen from you. It's about what you built, this fierce, undeniable new universe you created from the wreckage.
This whole journey really highlights that central idea. The transformation of that raw biological urgency into a structure, whether it's the physical structure of the studio bateau or the linguistic structure of the story, is not some gentle artistic process. It is a high-tension system for survival.
And that brings us right back to the power of the neuroplastic narrative. Understanding that this kind of suffering is rooted in adaptive biological change, not in personal pathology, is crucial. It's vital not just for survivors, but for their loved ones, for all of us. It demands we approach healing with more context and less judgment. The book, born from sheer necessity, really is a blueprint for anyone who recognizes the fierce, difficult beauty in reconstruction.